The digital cork is an NFT or a non-fungible token that is a digital twin for a bottle of wine. It serves as a deed of ownership, and we're going to register your ownership on the blockchain. This is a certificate of authenticity. It says this bottle came from the winery. It provides a chain of custody for that bottle. If you bought that bottle from Chateau Palmer, and then you sold it to me, and then I sold it to my friend, on that chain of custody, it would show all of those transactions. It provides transparency to the industry. Just as importantly, it discourages counterfeiting or fraud. Because if the person that I sold it to opens up the bottle and there's fruit juice inside, well, there's only a couple of people to go and see about that, right? So it's a big disincentive against fraud and counterfeiting.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 207. Are you curious about how blockchain technology will transform how you buy and collect wine? How do non-fungible tokens or NFTs play a role? And how can blockchain technology prevent counterfeit wines? You'll hear those tips and stories in my chat with David Garrett, who is co-founder of a global non-fungible token NFT wine club. Now, a quick update on my upcoming memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. Last week, I mentioned that dialogue is action in memoir for a number of reasons. The only risk with dialogue is when it becomes stilted or expository. Stilted dialogue sounds unnatural, as though it's being spoken by robots. There are some tells, such as not using contractions the way we do in everyday speech. So, for example, I am not opposed to the idea, however, I would like to have more information first. Compare that to, I'm not opposed to the idea, however, I'd like to have more information first. So I've replaced with I am and I would, very robotic, with I'm and I'd, because that's how we talk. The best way to improve dialogue is to eavesdrop on conversations whenever you can, at a coffee shop, waiting in line at the grocery store or the liquor shop, wherever. Next week, I'll dive into another dialogue danger, exposition. In the meantime, here's a new review from Carolyn Hinton, a beta reader in Auburn, Alabama. This was one of my favorite memoirs of all time. I had heard of Natalie before reading her book, but had never put it together that she is not only a wine critic, but also a super taster. A super taster is someone who has more taste buds than most people and can pick up on subtle nuances in flavor that most people can't. In Natalie's case, she's gifted in articulating those nuances of flavor in a unique and original way. The author was happily married for years until things fell apart and she ended up divorced. The way she often felt with her husband resonated with me. Miraculously, she met a wonderful man pretty soon after her divorce. She subsequently threw herself even more into her job as a critic and taster. Not being familiar with how the wine industry works, I learned a lot about vineyards, wine companies, and those who run them, as well as the wine rating industry. As her story unfolds, the author shares how being a female in a male-dominated wine industry can be intimidating. Situations ranging from sexual innuendos, put-downs, and online bullying are in her story. What I love most about this book was her style of writing. She's incredibly funny and articulate. Her tone is not whiny or victim-like. She wove her story in a thoughtful and matter-of-fact way, telling exactly what happened and her feelings about it at the time. Overall, it's balanced and fair. I applaud her for exposing the profound sexism in the wine industry and for calling out those who took aim at her and what they said. Facing her male colleagues and standing up to them was not unlike the women who stood up to Harvey Weinstein in exposing the dominating influence he had in the movie industry. Not only did she stand up to them, but ultimately she didn't let them stop her from doing the things she does so well. Ironically, she is now even more influential in wine circles instead of less so. She's been a writer for wine columns and is a regular guest on TV shows. She teaches online wine and food pairing classes, and her blog is thriving. Overall, Natalie's upbeat personality and humorous reflections while recalling an emotionally trying time in her life make you feel like she is someone you'd want to be friends with. I'm proud of her for using her voice and her platform to speak out against sexism. I believe she'll lead the way in changing things for the better with this book she already has. Wow, Carolyn, thank you. I do want to be your friend. Thank you very much. I've posted a link to my blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/207. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. Okay, on with the show. Before I introduce our guest, let me just say that one of you is going to win a copy of his gorgeous book, The Wine Masters of Paso Robles. And this is a spectacular region, California. And all you have to do is email me. We will include a link and the book cover in the show notes. It is a gorgeous book. It looks like it would sit well on any coffee table, but also should be actually read. So all you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com and tell me you want to win a copy. All right, back to our guest. Since graduating from Michigan State University with a bachelor's degree in political science, Dave Garrett has spent more than 25 years in the fields of tech, wine, and finance. In 1994, he co-founded Intraactive, a software company that built the original intranet for the U.S. Army, among other projects. After he sold his company in 2004, he co-founded the Vines of Mendoza, developing more than 1,500 acres of vineyard land in Argentina, as well as a 5-star resort and restaurant. In 2013, he led a group of investors to buy the largest vineyard in Priorat, Spain, and today he is the co-founder of Club dVIN, a global non-fungible token NFT wine club, which we're going to hear more about. Welcome, Dave. It's so great to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time today. It's great
absolutely.
to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm super curious about all of this newfangled technology.
Yeah.
So before we dive into NFTs, Dave, tell us why you actually left the tech world, which sounded pretty exciting, and you were successful, and you went into the wine world.
Well, it's a long story. So my first company that I started when I was 22 was called Interactive, as you mentioned. We built the first intranet for the U.S. Navy, and it was really fun and interesting. We sold that company in 1998, probably a little soon. If we would have waited a little bit longer, we probably would have made a lot more money. But we sold it, and the bankers that sold that sent me actually to Los Angeles to advise some of their clients on the internet, and I was advising television studios and movie studios and on kind of what streaming was going to be like and how the internet was going to affect their business. This was in 1998, so way before Spotify or Netflix. And I don't know if you remember, but in March of 2000, the bottom fell out of the internet market and the stock market crashed and everyone said the internet died. And basically all of those studios and television executives said, wow, well, I'm glad that we don't have to worry about the internet anymore. So
that's done.
You can go and do something else and we're going to go back to business as usual. And so I thought that was pretty funny. And basically the idea was that I was just going to go travel for a year and wait for the internet to sort itself out. And I ended up in Mendoza, Argentina, about a year later with some friends. And it was just after the currency devaluation in Argentina, and kind of the whole country was on sale. Everything was very, very inexpensive if you had US dollars. And so we bought a bunch of raw vineyard land for, kind of 10 cents on the dollar. And it was a really great investment and changed really the trajectory of my life and my career.
And so you just happened to be in wine country and said, let's buy land. It's cheap. Like, let's get into the wine industry. Is that kind of what sort of drew you to it?
I was traveling through South America and I was in Cusco, Peru. And I met a girl and she danced tango
Oh,
and she wanted to go to Buenos Aires. So I
of
said, okay.
course.
And we went to Buenos Aires and she left, but I stayed because I really loved Argentina. I loved the people. And I just started trading real estate. I was buying apartments at the time, buying apartments in Buenos Aires and selling them. I knew some Spanish and I knew how the real estate market worked. And so the story goes, an old friend came to visit and we went to Mendoza for the weekend. I stayed for 10 years. He has stayed for the rest of his life. And
Wow.
he's been there ever since. And I don't think he plans on leaving anytime soon. It is a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful place.
It is. I've had the privilege of visiting and Buenos Aires and went to some dance clubs. I
Yeah.
love that mix of culture, the food, the wine, the asado, the tango, everything. And it's a beautiful, they call it Paris of South America, I think. Buenos Aires is a beautiful city. And of course, the wine region, Mendoza, is spectacular as well.
It really is beautiful. Unfortunately, I have 2 left feet, so I didn't really get to dance tango, but I met my wife in Buenos Aires and I have 2 Argentine daughters.
Huh.
We don't live in Argentina anymore, but both my daughters were born there.
Oh, wow. Wow. And was there a wine that sort of turned your head, like that really spoke to you and thought, oh, I need to find out more about this?
So I really loved the wine. And, when I was in Argentina, like I said, everything was on sale. You could get a steak dinner and a bottle of the best wine you've ever had for $10. And we drank a lot of really, really great wine at the time. But I would say less an individual wine and more a winemaker. I was very fortunate to meet Santiago Achával, who became our consulting winemaker at the Vines of Mendoza and is still to this day one of my heroes. He taught me more about wine than anyone. I was kind of fresh faced and 28 years old, I think, didn't really know much about anything. And he really took us under his wing. And I learned just so much from him about terroir and about winemaking. And he's obviously, Santiago is probably the highest rated winemaker in Argentine history and also comes from a really interesting background. He was the CFO of a cement company.
Oh,
So the hard sciences came from a very data and analytic background. And when he started making wine, I could really relate to that coming from also being an entrepreneur. And from the business side, I found his approach really interesting and the mix of, science and art. I would say he inspired me and that started, a really long trail of people in the wine industry that inspired me even more than the wine itself.
oh, wow. That's great. Drawn to the people. And so then you were planting this vineyard. It took a long time. Tell us why it took so long to actually plant the vineyards that you bought.
So we purchased some property in the Uco Valley and we purchased land literally across the street from Costa de Siete. So
Oh,
one of
wow.
the reasons that we knew that we were in a good region and that we were getting a pretty good deal was the Costa de Siete property in the Uco Valley was started 4 years earlier. And that project, as you may or may not know, was really launched by Michel Rolland.
Right. The famous flying winemaker from Bordeaux.
That's right. And, he makes wine all over the world. He signs
Hmm.
bottles, I want to say, in more than a dozen countries. But there's only one place in the world where he owns vineyard land,
Ah,
and that's in the Uco Valley in Mendoza.
I didn't know that.
And as soon as we heard that story and talked a little bit to Michel and his people, we got to understand that there was really a great opportunity. The problem is that the land that we bought was virgin land and right at the base of the Andes. So it was this alluvial soil that had been, kind of falling down the highest peaks of the Andes for 10,000 years. So when the surveyor went out and drew the first lines in order to create the deed for the property, he had to do it on horseback.
It was so uneven.
It was so uneven and so rough.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
for the first 2 years, we only approached the land on horseback. The first thing we did, you mentioned Argentina asado. The very first thing we did, and we learned this, it was really fun to build a new project in Argentina because what we learned is everything's done by hand. You need a lot of workers to create a vineyard, especially on virgin land in Argentina. So the first thing that we built was a giant grill, a parrilla, in the middle of the property looking at the Andes. And that was because in order to get the workers to come, they needed a place for them to cook lunch. And so it's really interesting how that process works. But the very first thing that we built was this giant parrilla that was big enough to serve, 100 people,
Oh,
to
wow.
cook
That
meat
big.
for
Yeah.
100 people. Yeah.
My goodness. And
Every
asada
day.
being the outdoor barbecues, I forgot to mention for those who might not be familiar with that term. But yeah, it's a
Right,
beautiful
right, right.
communal kind of feeling when you're cooking outside all around this giant grill, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was great. And, we did that every day for years. So the first year was really just doing a proper survey and figuring out where to put the wells and drilling the wells.
Hmm.
The second year was leveling the property. That took some heavy machinery, but also, we needed to move some big rocks. We needed to remove some trees. There were some things that we needed to do in order to make it work. And that took a long time. It was very, very uneven land. And then the third year we put in the post. So it really takes a pretty significant amount of time just to get started with a vineyard in the Uco Valley, or at least that's true. It was true for us with virgin land.
A little bit different from creating software, eh?
Very, very different. Yeah. I mean, I think the time from our first dollar of investment to our first dollar of revenue from wine that we sold from the property was about 10 years. That's pretty different. In the software business, if you don't have your first revenue in 3 to 6 months, then you should be looking at a different business.
Wow.
So it was a really eye-opening and interesting experience. It taught a lot about patience. I think winemaking teaches you a lot about being careful,
Mm-hmm.
and it teaches you about high stakes. The stakes of winemaking, what we say all the time is if you're a chef and you make a meal and you make a mistake, you just throw it away and make another one.
It's true.
But if you're a winemaker, you only get about 30 bites at the apple. If you have a fantastic career,
Mm-hmm.
you probably only get about 30 bites at the apple.
That's true.
Meaning,
Number of
like if
vintages,
you
yeah.
screw up one of those years, you're dumping the wine and waiting for the next year. And that's not great.
That's a whole year, yeah.
So we really learned a lot.
Wow. And did that tie into your data-oriented approach? Like, how did you approach wine? It seems you approached it very methodically, all this sort of mapping out the vineyard and so on. But in what other ways did you approach winemaking from a sort of data-oriented approach that you perhaps imported from the software world?
The property was pretty large, about 1,500 acres. And from the lowest elevation to the highest elevation, I think it was 850 meters above sea level to 1,150 meters above sea level. So about 300 meters. So 1,000 feet. So a 10-story building.
Quite a range.
Yeah. And it was all very flat and very nice, but we had a big range. And so we really wanted to figure out how to make great wine on that property. And we knew that we had time. We had a few years. And the people in Argentina are very open and warm and inviting. And one of the first things that we did is we hired a team of sommeliers. There's a very famous sommelier school in Mendoza. So we found a great team to start teaching us about wine. And one of the first things that we did is literally went out and found all of the best wines that were made in the region and created as many data points as we could for those wines. Everything from what's the elevation of the vineyard, how far are the vines apart, how far are the rows apart, what's the height of the training wire, obviously what kind of irrigation are they using at all. And everyone kind of needs to use irrigation in the Uco Valley. What kind of clone they were using, what kind of rootstock they were using. And we just compiled all the data. And we went out and talked to them. We had a bunch of data that we collected in the vineyard itself, where we would go and look and take readings we'd take a measuring stick and measure the distance between the posts and measure the distance between the plants. We'd look and see what kind of cover crop they had. And probably for about 300 different wines, we collected all of that data and then as much data as we could about the winemaking process. And then we compared that data to success in the market, what kind of price points they were getting, what kind of scores they were getting. And based on that, it allows us to say, all right, well, at 950 meters, at this place in our vineyard, we're going to recommend that we're going to plant at this angle to the sun, this many feet between rows, this many feet between plants. here's the density, here's the irrigation system, here's the height of the training wire, trying to basically, follow best practices. So we basically wrote the book on best practices using data.
That's so meticulous. That sounds like a software program in and of itself, not just a book.
It was. We had lots and lots of data. It was great. It was really interesting. A lot of people told us we were crazy. A lot of people still tell us we're crazy. I mean, at the Vines of Mendoza, I think in any given year, they're doing 300 unique fermentations or more. So it's an insane project, but it's a fantastic project.
Huh. And you said you also create like 300 labels. Are you kind of a crush facility for others who don't want to have their own facility? Are you making wines for other people as well?
So just to be clear, I'm not part of the Vines of Mendoza anymore. I'm a competitive project in Prira. But at the Vines, what we did, which was very interesting and a little bit different from like Harlan Estate or other projects like that, is we created a private vineyard estate program where you could go down, you could purchase a vineyard inside of our property, and we would plant it to spec and wine make to spec for you. So we have everyone from Omaha Steaks to Wolfgang Puck and a bunch of other brand names that make wine on our property, that own vineyards within the Vines of Mendoza and make wine there, to a lot of little restaurants. Some of the best restaurants in the US and in Europe make their house wine at the Vines of Mendoza. So it's a really unique project. Mm-hmm. It was a unique business model that we created way back in the day, and it was really fun, and it was a great project.
Oh, sounds great. So I would love to keep talking about that, but since our core interest here is the NFTs, you mentioned in a previous interview that 10 to 15% of wines on the market are fake or could be fake, which is astounding. So before we dive into NFTs, they help prevent wine fraud. That's why we're talking about them, among other things. Maybe you could share a couple of famous bottles, fake bottles that have been on the market previously that people may have heard of.
Sure. Well, I mean, the most famous is from the movie Sour Grapes, if anyone has seen that. It's a Jefferson bottles that I think Charles Koch bought and ended up being fake. And there was a, Rudy Curtawan, I think, sold those bottles. It was a nightmare at the time. And actually,
it was Thomas Jefferson, the former president of
Thomas
the United States.
Seller. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's really interesting. There are a lot of these famous cases, from the movies. And we work a lot with Maureen Downey. She was the certification expert in that film, and she's one of our founding members.
And she's been a guest on this podcast previously.
Yeah, she's a really, really great, wonderful, colorful person. We actually have a really fun project that we're doing with her that I can tell you about later. But the interesting thing is, all those big bottles, they get the headlines.
Yes.
But the truth is, the worst problems with wine counterfeiting are not the big fancy bottles. They're a facility in China that is creating penfolds by the pallet, right? Creating counterfeit penfolds by the pallet.
Really?
Or actually, the worst case of counterfeit happened just earlier this year. A winemaker in Bordeaux was arrested for counterfeiting his own wine.
Oh,
basically importing grapes and importing their own wine. So it's a problem. Maureen will tell you that somewhere around 20% of the wines in that collectible and investment grade category are likely fake or counterfeit. We think that, our solution does a lot to disincentivize counterfeit and fraud, and also, more importantly, incentivize more clear provenance for those kind of investment grade and collectible wines.
The history of the wines. Okay. But some of those, just for those listening, like, I don't know how much the Jefferson bottle sold for, was like tens of thousands or more.
I think it was $175,000.
Hundreds of thousands. Yeah. Because it's supposed to be the original. All right. So before, again, we dive into NFTs, I'd like to clarify some terms. I tried to figure it out, but you're the expert. So the underlying technology, the foundational layer, you're going to tell me, is blockchain. Is it correct that it's a digital ledger or a database of transactions that's sort of distributed across a network of computers, and no one computer organization holds or stores all those records?
Well, yes, but actually it's a little different than that.
Okay,
all of the computers store all of the records.
Ah, okay.
That's the idea behind consensus, right?
Okay.
So tens of thousands of computers have the exact same database.
Okay.
And any change you need to have consensus among all of those computers in order to change that database. And the
Okay.
change is also really important. A lot of times, the best analogy that I can give people for the blockchain is similar to like the land records at your local real estate office.
Right.
When you buy a house, the way the land record is updated, it's not like they erase the old owner and then put your name in.
Okay.
What they do is they create a ledger and they create a new entry in that ledger for a new owner. And they say, okay, this house has changed ownership from you to the next person, or from the old owner to you. And that's really what the blockchain is, right? It's not a database where information is ever overwritten. It's never overwritten. It's always appended to, right? So anytime a transaction is made, there's a new entry in the database, and all of those computers have to agree that, yes, that new entry is valid.
All
And
right.
that's what makes it very, very difficult. If not, most people say that it is impossible to hack,
Right.
which is why there are now trillions of dollars of value that are stored on the blockchain.
Huh. That really helps me to understand it, and I'm sure our listeners as well. And so, sitting on top of this sort of distributed digital ledger is cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Is that right? Or how does that work? What's the difference between blockchain and Bitcoin?
Sure. So Bitcoin is an asset that sits on the blockchain, right? In the same way that your house is an asset that sits on the real estate ledger, right?
Right.
Like your house only has value to you because your local real estate office says that you own it,
Right.
right? Otherwise,
Yep.
there would be no value. Actually, really interestingly true in a lot of countries around the world that don't have good land records. The house is kind of the person that's living in it. And that makes it impossible to get a loan from it. It makes it impossible to sell it. Like, it's not a very valuable asset unless you can claim and know who is the owner of that asset. And so
Okay.
that's really what blockchain does. So if you think about it, like one Bitcoin is like a 50,000 acre piece of land in Nebraska.
Okay.
But if you were to buy half a Bitcoin, then the update of the ledger would say, okay, we're going to cut that piece of land in half and we're going to give half to you, and the other half stays with the person that owned it before. And then if someone decides that they want to buy a quarter or half of your Bitcoin, so now a quarter, it would get split up again. So the ledger is kept in that same way, in the same
Huh.
way as like a land registry, where you can make divisions anytime you want. You can cut a Bitcoin to as little as 0.00001 Bitcoin, or even smaller than that, I think. And all of that information is kept on the blockchain forever. And the only way that it's updated is if all of those computers agree. And so Bitcoin is a currency that sits on the Bitcoin blockchain, which is a specific blockchain that is created just for Bitcoin.
Right. Okay. Then we get into non-fungible tokens, your business.
Sure.
Fungible, of course, is anything that can be exchanged, like one $10 bill can be exchanged for another. But non-fungible means the opposite. It's unique, it's one of a kind, it can't be exchanged because there's nothing like it. So tell us what non-fungible tokens are in relation to blockchain and maybe even Bitcoin, so we understand kind of the differences.
Sure. So Bitcoin is, like you said, it is a fungible token. You can exchange one Bitcoin for any other Bitcoin, or you can exchange a half a Bitcoin for any other half a Bitcoin, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it is a currency and it's a store of value.
Okay.
A non-fungible token is you would say, two different items that are not exchangeable for one another. So again, let's look at the real estate analogy, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if there are two houses in the same neighborhood, and maybe they have the same amount of land and they were built at the same time and they were built by the same architect and they have the exact same layout, just like lots of neighborhoods around the world,
Sure.
those are still unique homes, right? They are
Yes.
unique assets. So they're non-fungible. You can't just go home and decide to walk into your neighbor's house, right? Like your house is your house and your neighbor's house is your neighbor's house. And that's really what a non-fungible token is. So it is, when you again use that same analogy, it's a deed of ownership for a single asset that can't be traded with any other asset, right? It is a
Right.
single unique asset.
Okay. Like an individual bottle of wine.
Yeah, like a bottle of wine. And that
Yeah.
unique asset, and that sits on the blockchain, right? It's the same thing. So it's a deed of ownership, just like the deed to your house or the deed to your car, but it's a deed to, in a lot of cases, probably the most common usage for NFTs right now, or that you would hear about, is for pieces of art, right? Pieces
Yes.
of digital art. When people talk about NFTs, they'll say, I have an NFT of this, Bored Ape, let's say. That's obviously the most famous of them. Well, the NFT is actually the deed of ownership over that image. It's
Okay.
not the image itself, it's the deed of ownership. And it says, you are the owner of that image. And that deed is what is logged on the blockchain. And so ownership is actually the most important thing.
That really clarifies. And I really like your real estate analogy. That really makes it concrete because
Thank
sometimes
you.
these things can be so abstract, especially when they're online.
Sure.
All right. So now we get to wine. How do you create an NFT, a non-fungible token for one bottle of wine? What's the process?
So an NFT, as we said, it's a deed of ownership, but we work on the Ethereum blockchain, or we actually work on the Polygon blockchain, which is part of the Ethereum blockchain. And Ethereum does something a little bit interesting. So it not only provides the ability to have a deed of ownership, but it also provides a smart contract. So it's a piece of software that tells you, or that provides instructions for how transactions work. And I know we're starting to get pretty esoteric here, and I apologize. But
That's
think
okay.
about it like this. We developed a piece of technology called the digital cork. And the digital cork is an NFT, or a non-fungible token, that is a digital twin for a bottle of wine. So that digital twin, it serves a bunch of different functions. The first function that it serves is as a deed of ownership. It says, okay, you own this bottle of wine. It identifies that bottle and says, you are the owner of that bottle, and we're going to register your ownership on the blockchain. The second thing it does is its certificate of authenticity. It says, this bottle came from the winery. There are other examples, and I can talk to you about that later, but it tells you this bottle came directly from this winemaker. So it says that this bottle is authentic.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that it does is it provides a chain of custody for that bottle. So that's kind of interesting, again, in the collectible and investment grade space. So, for example, if you bought that bottle from, Chateau Palmer, you bought a 2001 Alter Ego from Chateau Palmer, and then you sold it to me, and then I sold it to my friend, on that chain of custody, it would show all of those different transactions. It would say, okay, you bought it from Chateau Palmer, and then I bought it from you, and then someone bought it from me. It would show the date of the transaction. It would show the price of the transaction. So that chain of custody does some interesting things. It provides a lot of transparency to the industry, which is really nice. Chateau Palmer gets to see how their wines are being traded. But just as importantly, it discourages any kind of counterfeiting or fraud. Because if the person that I sold it to opens up the bottle and there's fruit juice inside, well, there's only a couple of people to go and see about that, right? They can look at the chain of custody and say, okay, well, it's either Dave or it's Natalie or it's, somewhere in between. So they can kind of figure it out. So it's a big disincentive against fraud and counterfeiting. But more importantly, we think it's a big incentive for clean provenance. And think about it this way.
The history of the wine provenance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that 2001 Chateau Palmer Alter Ego, if you were to go on Wine Searcher today and look, that you'd probably find a few dozen bottles in different places around the world, but they would all be about the same price. Now, if you could see the chain of custody and say, okay, one of those bottles sat in a bonded warehouse in Bordeaux for 21 years, and the other one had an owner in Hong Kong, and then had an owner in Dubai, and then was shipped to San Antonio, and then Chicago, and finally now it's up for auction in New York. Well, you're going to have a different price. The wine that sat in the bonded warehouse, you're going to pay a lot more for than the bottle that's had 5 different owners.
That's
And
true.
that price differential, I think, is what's going to create huge incentives for people to have more clean provenance for their wines. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. because trading owners 5 times, you don't know how the bottle was treated in shipment, how it was stored. Whereas if you can lock it down to one place one time and you know the conditions of storage in that bonded warehouse, then you're more assured that when you open it, it's not going to have a problem, like be off or tainted or whatever.
That's 100% right.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with David. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, David had such a clear and concrete way of explaining how blockchain technology works and how it will transform the way we buy and collect wine. 2, I liked his comparisons to buying land and a house with non-fungible tokens or NFTs. It really, for the first time, made it clear in my mind what these things were. And 3, I was glad to hear that blockchain technology may help prevent counterfeit wines in the future. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with David, links to his website, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free ultimate guide to wine and food pairing, and that's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/207. Email me if you have a tip, sip, question, or want to be a beta reader of my new memoir at nataliemclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with David. In the meantime, if you missed episode 29, go back and take a listen. I talk about wine scandals, fakes, and forgeries with Maureen Downey. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
I worked in auctions for many years, and I've been managing private wine collections. And it's not just the crusty old 1960 bottle that we need to worry about, because the current wine fraud that we're seeing is recent vintages, recent releases. So if you think that you don't buy $1,000 bottles and therefore wine fraud doesn't affect you, you're wrong. There's been a lot of Miraval Rosé that's counterfeit. There's more and more Brunello de Montalcino in the $40 range that is coming out as counterfeit. So this really does hit all aspects of the industry. And that is because we have seen such low punishment for those who get caught doing this, that organized crime has gotten into the game. Because if you get caught human trafficking or trafficking drugs, you're going away forever. You get caught counterfeiting wine or selling counterfeit wine, you maybe get a slap on the wrist, if that, literally.
If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the tips, wines, and stories we shared. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a wine with non-fungible authenticity. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.